On April 23rd, 1985, Coca-Cola's chairman stood in front of reporters in New York and announced that after 99 years, the company was changing the formula of the best-selling soft drink in American history and discontinuing the original entirely. He called it the boldest single marketing move in the history of the packaged goods business. He wasn't wrong about the boldness. He was catastrophically wrong about how it would land. Within weeks, Coca-Cola's switchboard was reportedly receiving thousands of angry calls a day. A retired Seattle businessman formed a protest organization called the Old Cola Drinkers of America, which claimed tens of thousands of members and filed a class action lawsuit demanding the original formula's return. Grocery stores in some cities reported customers buying up and hoarding whatever original formula stock remained on shelves, treating cases of old Coke like an investment asset. Letters poured into Coca-Cola's Atlanta headquarters. By some internal counts, over 40,000 of them in the weeks after the announcement, along with tens of thousands of phone calls, the overwhelming majority hostile. 79 days after announcing new Coke, Coca-Cola brought the original formula back, rebranded as Coca-Cola Classic, and effectively admitted the switch had been a mistake. It remains, to this day, one of the fastest and most complete public reversals in corporate history. The decision to change Coke's formula wasn't made on a whim, and it wasn't made out of arrogance alone. It was made in response to a genuine competitive threat that had been building for years. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Pepsi had been steadily eating into Coca-Cola's market share, driven in large part by a marketing campaign called the Pepsi Challenge, blind taste tests run in shopping malls and eventually broadcast on television, where ordinary consumers repeatedly picked Pepsi's sweeter formula over Coca-Cola's in side-by-side comparisons. The campaign was a genuine marketing masterstroke, and it was working. By the early 1980s, Coca-Cola's internal research showed Pepsi consistently winning blind taste tests, and Coke's market share lead over its rival had been shrinking for years. Coca-Cola's leadership, worried about a slow but real erosion of the company's core product, spent roughly 2 years and a reported $4 million developing a new formula, sweeter, smoother, designed specifically to beat Pepsi in blind taste tests. And by the numbers Coca-Cola had gathered before launch, it worked. The company tested the new formula against both original Coke and Pepsi in blind taste tests, involving, by some accounts, close to 200,000 consumers, and the new formula reportedly won those head-to-head comparisons. On paper, this looked like overwhelming evidence. The problem was what that research didn't measure. Coca-Cola's testing had been rigorously designed to answer one question: which formula tastes better in a blind sip test? What it never adequately measured was a completely different question. How would people feel about Coca-Cola discontinuing the original recipe entirely? Those are not the same question, and the difference between them turned out to be the entire story. A blind taste test strips away brand identity, nostalgia, ritual, and emotional attachment. It isolates pure flavor preference in a lab-like setting. But Coca-Cola wasn't just a flavor. By 1985, it was a piece of American cultural identity, tied up in decades of advertising that had explicitly linked the brand to patriotism, nostalgia, and continuity. The company had spent generations telling consumers that Coca-Cola was the real thing, a phrase used in its own advertising, and then it turned around and replaced the thing itself. Consumer psychologists who studied the backlash afterward pointed to what's sometimes called the endowment effect. People tend to place outsized value on things specifically because they already own or are attached to them, well beyond what a neutral comparison would suggest. Losing something familiar, it turns out, registers very differently than simply preferring an alternative in a side-by-side comparison. Coca-Cola had built one of the most emotionally loaded brands in the world, and then ran a product decision through research designed to measure a much narrower, purely sensory preference, completely missing the sense of loss the change would trigger. The reaction wasn't just about taste either. For a notable subset of the loudest protesters, particularly in the American South, the backlash carried an undertone of regional identity. Coca-Cola had been founded in Atlanta and had long been marketed as a symbol of Southern heritage. Some of the angriest public responses to New Coke framed the change as almost an affront to that regional pride, not simply a product complaint. Coca-Cola's own executives were reportedly stunned by the intensity of the response. The company's president at the time later said in interviews that the passion of the backlash caught leadership completely off guard. They had modelled the risk of the new formula underperforming against Pepsi, but not the risk of a segment of loyal customers reacting as though the company had taken something from them personally. By late June 1985, less than 3 months after the initial announcement, Coca-Cola's leadership reversed course. On July 11th, they announced the return of the original formula under the name Coca-Cola Classic, while keeping the new formula on shelves as well, rebranded simply as Coke 2. The reversal made national news. Some accounts from the time described network news anchors interrupting regular programming to announce it, treating a soft drink recipe change as a genuine national story. Here's where the story gets more interesting than the standard corporate disaster framing suggests. Coca-Cola Classic, once relaunched, saw a significant sales surge, and by some measures, Coca-Cola's total market share and sales for the year actually grew faster in 1985 than they had in the years immediately before the new Coke launch. The company's president at the time, when later asked directly whether the whole episode had been a deliberate marketing stunt, denied it, insisting the backlash was real, the mistake was real, and the recovery was simply the result of an enormous, unplanned wave of renewed public affection for the original product once people believed they might lose it for good. Whether or not it was intentional, the effect was undeniable. New Coke had accidentally reminded tens of millions of people how much they loved the original, in a way no advertising campaign could have manufactured on purpose. Coke 2, the rebranded original new formula, lingered on shelves in a shrinking number of markets for over a decade before Coca-Cola finally discontinued it entirely in the mid-2000s, fading out with barely a headline, a quiet end for the product that had briefly been positioned as the future of the world's most famous soft drink. New Coke sits in an unusual place in the history of corporate failures, because the product itself wasn't really the problem. By Coca-Cola's own blind testing, people liked how it tasted. The failure was in what the research measured and what it didn't. Coca-Cola had rigorously tested flavour preference and almost completely ignored brand attachment, nostalgia, and the emotional cost of taking something familiar away from people who felt ownership over it, even though they'd never manufactured a drop of it themselves. It's a mistake that shows up again and again whenever an established company redesigns something people have quietly built identity around: a familiar app interface, a beloved product packaging, a long-running logo. The data can say people will prefer the new version in a controlled test and still be measuring the wrong thing entirely. Next time we're looking at a story where the warning signs weren't hidden in bad research. They were sitting in plain sight, ignored by a board that desperately wanted to believe in one woman's story. That's Theranos.